if something's going to take 2 minutes or less, do it now. This is one of those things where people put things off for years or months or weeks or just like a really long time that it doesn't need to be put off for that long. And then it ends up taking them 2 minutes. And then once it's done, it's done. Those things just hang over you if you don't do them. And the stress, the cumulative stress of having these things hanging over you it can really, really wear you down. So if it's going to take 2 minutes or less, just do it now. You'll be so thankful for it.
Flora, thank you very much for coming on. How are you doing?
Very well, thanks. How are you?
I'm doing well. I've got a bit of a croaky voice, which is obviously fantastic as a podcast host, but I'm hoping I can just pass all conversation on to you. So we spoke a little bit off camera beforehand and covered a few things that we're going to get back onto. But to start off with, I'd love to hear how you define health in the modern world.
So I think in this day and age, we have to include both physical and mental health. You can't just have one without the other. And yesterday I actually looked up the World Health Organization's definition of what health is. And I'm pleased to say that it does now include mental health as well as physical health, although I'm sure that hasn't always been the case. I mean, I know that in the past I have found that people don't necessarily think of mental health as important as physical health. But the WHO defined it as a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. So I think that sounds pretty thorough, so I'm going to go with that one.
No, that is very thorough. And what are the experiences that you've had in the past that underpin your definition of health as an individual? Because I know you've had an evolution of sorts in many, many different ways that means that I think from what I've gathered, you align quite closely with the World Health Organization's definition. So what are the sort of key life experiences, upbringing, experiences as a teenager, and everything that's got you to this point that mean you align with that definition?
Yeah, so when I was younger, I suffered a kind of version of orthorexia, which is a kind of an addiction to eating as healthily as possible. And the irony is that, of course, you go down the route of eating as healthily as possible and you end up extremely unhealthy because of it. So I know that there is such thing as too healthy when it comes to food. And I think when the definition of health doesn't incorporate the mental side of things, you kind of risk losing the overall holistic version of health. And I think a lot of people, if they'd looked at me back then, they would have thought, oh, she looks really healthy. You know, she's got a healthy BMI or a healthy physique or whatever. When in reality, I was really struggling to get out of bed in the morning. I was really struggling to concentrate at school, spent a good deal of my time crying. And I don't think we can really count that as being totally healthy. I mean, if you'd asked me at the time, did I feel healthy? I would have undoubtedly said absolutely not. So I think if we don't include mental health in the definition, then we can't have this holistic view of what healthy is.
I 100% agree, and actually orthorexia is not something I've ever really discussed too openly because it's not as commonly known as other eating disorders, but it's definitely something that I suffered with as a 17/18-year-old, so I can still remember, and I'm not going to bother, but I could recount the breakfast, 11 o'clock snack, 12:30 lunch, 3 o'clock snack, dinner, and before bed snack I had for almost 18 months verbatim, because it was always the same all day, every day, because it was a control thing for me.
Yeah.
And it actually took being on a holiday with my friends where we were given food where I literally didn't have a choice, whereby you eat this or you don't eat. And that was what actually slowly allowed me to find a healthier version of what outwardly was being deemed healthy. So no, it's always fascinating to speak to somebody who understands the sort of nuances of that specific eating disorder. And it never really affected me too directly, but it was definitely something that retrospectively I've acknowledged as a self-diagnosis, I'd say.
Well, I think actually probably a lot more people, sorry to interrupt, I think a lot more people than we think actually struggle with it, because I think social media can often reward behaviors that in everyday life actually might not be healthy. And I think that's why this conversation about mental health is so important. Because if they look at their life and think, look, well, I feel like I'm doing all the right things. I feel like I'm being really healthy. And then why aren't I happy? It might click in people's head and think, oh, well, hang on a second. If we're going to include happiness and mental health in our definition of health, then maybe there are some things that need to change. Maybe I need to let go control a little bit. And I think it's great that these conversations are happening.
100%, and I'm much happier taking a less dogmatic approach to things now, because it's freed me from the sort of prison of pressure that I put myself in, whereby I went through a phase where I was 18 where I just said, no, I'm not going to drink. As an 18-year-old growing up in Scotland, that's very niche, let me tell you. So I took that because I thought a dogmatic solution would make it easier for me to be in constant control. But what's the flip side of that? I was missing out on social occasions. I was leaving things early because I wasn't part of the social interaction, which in my mind is a key component of overall holistic health. So I think that the parameters have shifted, which is fantastic. But as you've said, the flip side is we've now got other elements of quote-unquote orthorexia, whereby you need to get out of bed at 5 a.m, otherwise you're not doing well enough, these sort of things, which are equally as damaging and don't account for the relative demands of the individual.
Yeah.
So, with that in mind, what behaviours and practice are essential, well, what behaviours and practices, rather, are essential to you on a day-to-day basis to basically fulfil that definition?
Well, I think you touched on it really nicely before, talking about balance. And so for me, keeping healthy is about far more than just keeping fit, although, I mean, anyone who follows me know that I really love keeping fit as well, but I view that as part of the balance of keeping healthy. So it's not just about going running several times a week and going to the gym. It's also about making sure that I get out for fresh air, and that I listen to birdsong, and that I eat loads of variety of food every day, every week, and that I speak to my friends and family regularly, and that I have some variety in my work, and also the balance between work and play and rest especially. And also one thing, it might sound really wanky, but gratitude I think is really important for me. I used to keep a gratitude journal, and while I don't do that anymore, it was probably the biggest thing that changed me from being a very negative, pessimistic thinker where every situation had a negative, to the sort of person where in every single situation, even if it is actually quite a bad situation, I can almost always think of the positive, and I try to go through life looking at the positives in things. And that doesn't mean that I don't struggle with things, and it doesn't mean that I am toxically positive or whatever. I still very much understand that we have different emotions other than the positive ones, and I respect that. But actually, I think looking at the positives in life can really make a big difference to how happy you are. And you're the only person who loses if you're always thinking negatively, and you're the person who wins if you're trying to think positively. So I try and encompass that in everyday life.
No, I completely agree, and I sniggered when you said it sounds wanky to say gratitude, because everybody I know that practices gratitude always caveats it by saying it seems a bit weird, but it's funny, in probably 5 years there's going to be something else which people are saying, oh, this sounds a bit wanky, but this is what I do, because journaling 5 years ago, somebody would have prefaced it by saying, oh, it seems a bit wanky, but yet here we are, and it's commonplace now. So that perspective shift that you've had in terms of viewing everything as positive, or at the very least neutral, I'd imagine, I know from personal experience, for me, has been massively refined and developed by ultra endurance running, ultra endurance events, triathlon, all the things that I've done in the past. So do you want to just run us through your, I know you'll say this is wanky as well, your fitness journey from 5Ks to ultras?
Yeah, of course. So like many people, when I first started running, I absolutely hated it. I could barely get to the end of my road without feeling like I wanted to vomit. I really struggled. And although I did do lots of sport kind of from the age of 15, before that point, I would always be sort of the last one picked in teams during PE or sports or whatever. I definitely was seen as sort of the more academic type than someone who might be on a hockey team or a netball team or whatever. Although I quickly discovered that actually, just as an aside, that wasn't to do with the fact that I wasn't good at those sports or wasn't good at sports in general. It was that I hadn't actually found the sport that I enjoyed. And so when I found squash, which is kind of, at the time, definitely at school, it was quite niche. Once I found that, I realized, oh, hang on a second, it's not that I'm bad at all sports. It's that I hadn't, at that point, found a sport that suited me. And it turns out I hate team sports. So running works really well for me. Squash works really well for me. I do boxing as well, and weightlifting, all of which are pretty individual sports. So I first really properly started endurance training when it was about in 2018, when I was asked to do Tokyo Marathon, which is a very, very cool first big endurance race to do. But I was only asked to do it with about 2 months to race day. And I did my first 10-kilometer race in training for the marathon. And I can just say, I wouldn't necessarily recommend trying to train for your first marathon within 2 months, especially off the back of very little endurance training whatsoever. But I did it, I completed it. And whilst it destroyed kind of both my IT bands at the same time, it didn't put me off endurance running for good, which I think is kind of miraculous and says a lot about mindset and how you can kind of trick yourself into thinking that anything's fun if you try hard enough. And so it wasn't until 2020, during lockdown, that I did my first and my second ultra, official ultras, that is. So I did a 50-kilometer race up in the Peak District, and then was so happy with how that went and absolutely loved it that I immediately signed up to a 48-kilometer race down on the Jurassic Coast, on the southwest coast path of the UK, literally a month later, and just basically did the two back to back and had the best time. I think I can safely say they were two of the best days of my life, and that might be something to do with the runner's high. It might be something to do with the fact that I was in such amazing company, or that the places were beautiful, or a combination of everything. But those were the things that really got me hooked on long distance running that wasn't just on roads and wasn't just about hitting times and paces and trying to get your marathon within 4 hours or whatever. I found the pressure of that with road marathons to be quite a lot, whereas with trail marathons and ultra marathons, it seems to be a lot more to do with doing the best that you can do and beating the terrain and the conditions rather than just trying to get everything done as fast as possible. And just most recently, I did a much bigger ultramarathon that I genuinely wasn't entirely sure that I was going to be able to complete, which was the 125-kilometer Highland Ultra that was in the Highlands of Scotland. And that was a bit of a bigger challenge. The biggest day was 50K, which is obviously the longest I'd ever run before that. And that was the first day. And then I had 2 other days to do after that point. So I definitely had a couple more moments of questioning like what the hell I was doing during those 3 days. But overall, I had the most amazing time and did way better than I ever thought I would as well.
It's a different beast, isn't it? Doing a really big day and then waking up with the pain from the day before to, oh my God, I'm doing it again. So yeah. I think that the mental battle's won. This is the main thing for me. And like you said, the reason I avoid the marathons as a distance is because there's a bit of a subculture within it that I think detracts from the value of running in and of itself for enjoyment. And I think, as you've said, the process, the scenery, the runner's high, the company, the enjoyment, the lessons learned along the way from ultra running, in my mind, has proven more beneficial for me internally than just sending it on tarmac has done. So I can fully empathise with your experiences in that sense. So what were the biggest lessons taken from that journey? I can imagine, to put it into context for myself, I've gone from having no concept of how X distance could have been covered by anyone possibly to having been able to do it myself, and then reflecting, and the relative scale of what you feel you're capable of is massively increasing, and that then spills over into your day-to-day life.
Yeah, that would be 100% my first lesson. And I do think that ultras teach you more lessons than almost anything else in life. And with every single kilometer, they teach you a new lesson. So the longer the ultra, the more lessons you learn. And most of them are not just applicable to running. They are actually applicable to everything you do, really. And so the first one would be that you can do far more than you ever imagined possible. And that's exactly what you were just saying. When I first started running, like I said, I could barely run to the end of my road. And I thought, how on earth am I going to be able to run 5 kilometers nonstop? And of course, it took me a long time to be able to do that. I think my first 5-kilometer run took me 34 minutes, which, isn't super slow, but also is nowhere near as fast as I could then do it several years later. And I think if you put yourself in a situation where you don't think you can do something and then you work towards it and then you achieve it, it is the best thing, not only for your happiness, but also for your confidence in everyday life, to think, actually, you know what? That was something that I would have laughed in your face if you told me that I was going to be doing that a year ago. And yet this year, here we are doing it and completing it and managing and even having fun whilst doing it. So yeah, you can do far more than you thought that you could. My second lesson is to learn when to rest and not to quit. I think this is a really important one. I've seen it a lot online, and I kind of read it before I did ultramarathons. I read it and I was like, yeah, whatever. And then I did ultramarathons and I was like, oh no, they mean it literally. Like in an ultramarathon, if you get to an aid station or you get to the top of a mountain having climbed 2-3 hours, and you think, you know what, fuck this. Sorry, am I allowed to swear?
You are, freely.
Okay, great. You get to the top of a mountain.
It's too late. It's too late now, anyway.
Yeah. And you're like, okay, fuck this. I hated that. I've done 3 hours of climbing. I'm starving. We're nowhere near the end. I'm barely 20 kilometers into this race. I want to go home. The only way you can get home is by going back down the mountain to the next aid station and being picked up by someone, which is essentially the same thing as continuing the race. And so at that point, you're doing the distance anyway, but you don't get a medal at the end. So in my kind of weird, perverse brain, I think it's almost easier to keep going through the hard things, to get out the other end. And if that means having to sit down and have a sandwich on the top of a mountain, then like, you do that. Literally my first long distance race that wasn't Tokyo Marathon, it was like a 23-kilometer trail run. I sat down halfway up the mountain to have my lunch. I had a flask of tea, I had a sandwich, and I had a packet of crisps. And some people overtook me, and I was like, guys, when are you going to have your lunch? And it was like, we don't have lunch on a race like this. And I was like, how do you survive? So that was me resting. And you know what? I went and beat them on the downhills. I had my little kick of energy, and it was a great thing. So yeah, learn when to rest and not when to quit. And yeah, you'll get way further than you think you could.
It's fascinating actually, because I think I feel like I'm going down a rabbit hole of slandering those that just run on roads here, which is not my intention. But I think in the sort of 5K, 10K marathon, half marathon space, that manifests itself into day-to-day life as well, in the same way that the sort of old school gym bro mentality used to manifest itself, whereby you should always be working, you should never be resting. There's people outworking you, whereas I think taking a more holistic, almost spiritual with nature view to things in the way that you've approached your running development and the way that sort of I've approached mine, I think it just gives you a much healthier relationship with it and allows you to sit down and have your lunch halfway through a race. Imagine seeing somebody halfway through London Marathon sitting down and having a packet of crisps and a pint. I mean, hats off to them, and I'm sure they get a lot of TV time, but it's not something you conventionally see, is it?
No, definitely not. But I would recommend it for the next person doing London Marathon. Give it a go. See how you feel.
I need a place now. I'll trademark that little what I've coined there as my thing for next year. Hopefully, we'll see. Watch this space. But to move on a little bit, these lessons that you've learned from the journey you've been on in terms of the mental and physical health side of things obviously underpin who you are as a person now. And a critical component of who you are as a person is your education, passion, and emotional investment and outward investment into the sustainability space. And one element of that is with Leo's Box, which you are co-founder of. So do you want to just give us a brief on what the company is, what the ambitions are, what the development is, the challenges, just a bit of an overview?
Yeah, of course. So Leo's Box is a members club whereby you get access to loads of different sustainable products from various different brands at affordable prices. So our goal was to create a company, a business whereby people could access sustainable products, but without paying the premium that sustainable products are often sold at. And I really do feel like accessibility is a big barrier to people being more sustainable in their everyday life. So whether it's, you know, the skincare that you use, the hair care, the cleaning products around your house, the fact that you use a plastic scrubber on your dishes rather than one made of coconut that can then biodegrade at the end of its life. All of these things, people will choose the cheapest option. And at Leo's Box, what we do is we buy in bulk and buy huge quantities of things so that we can then pass on the savings that we get from doing that onto the customer. And what they do is they pay a £4 a month subscription fee, and that gets them access to all of the different things. So basically our profit is in that £4 a month, essentially, primarily. And that means that people can have access to all of these different products without paying that extra premium. And we also have an education space as well. So what we want to do is we think, you know, knowledge is power. If you know more about a subject, then you can be more empowered to make a change in your life and other people's lives. So we also try to kind of educate people along the way as well.
Fantastic. And you are registered as a B Corp, and we've spoken off screen, off air before this as well, as I was a small part of the B Corp accreditation process when I used to work at Viva Barefoot. So I have a little bit more understanding than I otherwise would, I think, on actually what it takes to get there. And I know you joined after Lysander had already had the B Corp accreditation, but obviously you're very well versed on the requirements for ethical trading practices in the industry that you're in, and especially in the products that Leo's Box supplies. So my sort of question to you is, do you think that B Corp hits the minimum standard required for ethical trading practices in the industries that it serves?
It's a really good question and an ongoing debate among a lot of people. So for those who don't know, B Corp tries to balance profit with people and the planet. That's what they say. And I think it does depend on what you mean by minimum standards and also what you mean by ethical trading. And there'll be lots of people, I think, who believe that there is no ethical consumption under capitalism, but the reality is that we live within a capitalist society, and therefore my view is that you have to do the best that you can do within that system. B Corp undoubtedly has its limitations, not least that it is really expensive, and that as a small business, it can be the difference between getting yourself some marketing or paying your workers more versus paying for B Corp. And I know that there will be loads and loads and loads of highly ethical, highly sustainable companies out there who just can't afford to get an accreditation like B Corp. And of course, it scales. So if you're a small company, you pay less. If you're a big company, you pay more. But that doesn't mean that it's cheap. And that was a conscious decision that we made. We know that we're sustainable, but we also wanted our customers to understand that and for that to be independently verified by someone. And again, another limitation is that it doesn't necessarily look at everything. So I know some B Corps who have received really high scores, but whose working practices have historically not been the best. They've not necessarily had the best workplace culture. And I think that's part of what we have to look at when we think about sustainable and ethical companies. So although they have really high B Corp scores, they might not actually be the best place to work. But having said all of that, I do think that independent accreditations and certifications like B Corp, and there are loads of others as well, really are the best way that we have currently of understanding which businesses really do prioritize sustainability, even if it is for some people just a tick box exercise. And they really are very in depth. It's not just a couple of boxes that you have to tick. I mean, it took us over a year to get accredited by B Corp, and we're a really, really, really small business. So it's not just the case of being like, yeah, I'm really sustainable, and them just giving you an accreditation. It is pretty in depth. So if you understand the limitations, then I think you can kind of look at a business and say, yes, they're B Corp accredited, but no, they're not sustainable. Or yes, they're B Corp accredited, and I've looked into them further, and I think they are really sustainable. I think you kind of have to make your own decision about it.
It's context is king again, isn't it? You can't look at things with a blanket opinion, which is very easy to do in the space. And I think there's too much polarization in terms of this is the only way to do things, that's the other way to do things, which makes it very difficult to go back to your earlier point on accessibility in general, whether it's financial or whether it's in terms of education. It's easier for people to think, oh, I'm going back to what we said before, the dogma around it. I'm going to do one thing, I'm going to do the other. Whereas informed decision-making through understanding the nuances of these things is actually what will probably lead you to the best conclusion overall. Yeah. And I think the context that you've given there, my take on B Corp is, as we spoke off camera before, there's no incentive to continue to develop within the criteria once accredited, which can potentially allow it to be manipulated in some degree, because there's a point system, isn't there, whereby I think Patagonia is still the highest worldwide and are best known for their sustainable and ethical practices, but they continue to grow year on year in terms of their scoring within B Corp, whereas I'm sure there are some companies that have got the accreditation and done the bare minimum to stay the same, which I think is why it's so important, as you've said, to look at B Corp and then look a little bit more into the company that has it, rather than just taking it as gospel that they are inherently therefore good.
100%. I think also very quickly that if different people prioritize different things within the sustainability space. So if you're looking at fashion, for example, a brand might be using really sustainable fabrics, but actually might not be paying a living wage or higher wages at their companies. And that in my view, for many people, that wouldn't equal a sustainable company. You've got to have the balance of ethics and sustainability. And I think within B Corp and various other accreditations as well, you can get really high scores in one thing, but pull your score above the minimum requirement, and then get quite low scores in some other things. And so long as you're above, as you say, that minimum requirement, there isn't necessarily the incentive to push up those low scores as well. And I think that really comes down to the individual business, whether they really are in it to improve themselves as a business and a force for good, or whether they really just want to get that minimum score of 80 or whatever it is and tick that box.
It's avoiding greenwashing, isn't it? It's that's a rabbit hole that I shouldn't even use that word. Actually, let's just move on. I think otherwise there'll be a whole separate podcast there, which I'm probably not well enough informed to actually support. So, with you mentioning the sort of limitations of the criteria to some degree, are there any other certifications or accreditations that you would recommend people look out for in products or companies?
It really, again, it depends what your, it depends which companies, it depends like which industries. So fashion is probably the one that I know most about. So you can look at Okotex and various other things that mean that they are both being paid living wage. So there's like, there are a bunch of accreditations that mean that the workers are being paid living wages. I can't off the top of my head remember which ones they are, but then also make sure that, for example, there are limited dangerous runoff of waste into the places where these clothes are being made. And I think there's no good saying, oh, because it's made in the UK, it's ethical, because we all know companies like Boohoo are paying £3.50 an hour and have horrendous working conditions. And then there are various things in Bangladesh and India where people are being paid much more and have much better working conditions. I think you really just have to take it on a case-by-case basis and do your research. And there's a really good company called goodonyou.eco where you can type in the name of a brand. And it's not the be-all and end-all, but it's a really good place to start. And it will give you a breakdown of planet, people, and animals. So how they treat each of those things and what score they get overall on a scale of like 1 to 5. So you can kind of see where your priorities lie and look at that site for the brand that you're looking into and decide whether or not a brand is ethical or sustainable based on those different parameters.
And I'm sure it's a space where those parameters and measures will be better recorded and better monitored. So hopefully that there'll be multiples of that website, or that website will become the be all and end all to be able to monitor these things as a consumer, customer, whatever you are in whatever industry. So fingers crossed, but that's very cool. I'll put that in the show notes as well, that website, so people can have a look. And as you've covered so many of the things and are so well informed on it, what are the bigger, the more significant actions that we can take as individuals, specifically in the UK, as it's the context in which we're both operating? What are the more significant actions individuals can take to have a more tangible impact to the crisis that we're in?
So I think, first of all, it's important that we look at things that are sustainable for us, as well as sustainable overall. So there's no point trying to switch around your whole life in one day and then live as an entirely different person, because chances are you won't be able to keep it up for a week. So my favorite things are really things that you only do once and then they continue working for you in a much more sustainable way. So things like moving your money to an ethical bank. It's something that I think people put off for so long, and yet it really, really, really isn't that scary, and it really doesn't take that long. I switched all my savings over to Triodos Bank a few years ago, and recently I switched my current account as well over to Starling, which is a bit more user-friendly in my eyes. There are loads of ethical and sustainable banks out there, and the problem with mainstream banks is that they invest in things like fossil fuels, arms, tobacco, various other things that aren't necessarily in line with your or my ethics. And by switching your money over to an ethical bank, your money is instead being invested in much more sustainable projects. And I think that's a really good way to do it, because it's not just about how you spend your money, it's about where your money is sitting when it's not being spent. And it literally took me 5 minutes to switch over to Starling. They did all of my direct debits at the same time as well. So it's not like I had to manually switch over, where I was paying my water, my council tax, all the other bills I have to pay. I wasn't having to manually switch those over, and literally just did it automatically, and it took me 5 minutes. So I thoroughly recommend doing that. And literally, I had to get COVID for me to be able to sit down and be like, why haven't I done this yet? And I had those 10 days to do it, and it took me 5 minutes. And I was like, why didn't I do this sooner? So that's one thing. Once you've done it, it's done. That's your money working for itself at that point. And I think that's really important. And on a similar note to that as well, switching over to an ethical pension service. I am with Tenfold, and you can choose for your money to only be invested in sustainable and ethical projects with that as well. And if you're self-employed, get set up, because if you're not self-employed, your organization, your business, wherever you work, will probably do it for you. But if you are self-employed, you have to set up your own pension. I'd really recommend doing it. It's nothing to do with sustainability. That's just about being an adult. My next one would be to switch to a green energy provider. Once you've done it, you're no longer contributing to the extraction of more fossil fuels, at least not when you turn on your lights or your heating or whatever. We used to do with Bulb, but they recently went into special administration. So we're going to switch to Octopus Energy soon. But there are loads in the UK. It's really easy to switch to whoever you find the best. So just do some research. It's not as hard as you think.
It's a really good way of looking at it, actually. The one action equals long-term acting, rather than it's the same as the fitness side of things, isn't it? As of tomorrow, I am going to only eat these things. Give it 3 days and you'll be on the phone to Domino's again, I'm sure. It's just the way we work as human beings. We need more incremental, tangible, smaller steps over time. Or, as you just very aptly said, one simple 5-minute task that I know a lot of people will have put off for a very long time because it seems like a big thing to do. And then you've got a lasting impact that doesn't require any further attention from you. So two great points there, really. Anything else? I feel like I cut you off just as you were saying something else there.
Well, obviously there are countless of things that you can do to make an impact. So, for example, I eat a vegan diet. I try not to fly. I try to get public transport. I don't own a car. I try to do as much as I can to be as sustainable as possible, but it really does have to be sustainable and manageable for you as well. So whether that is going vegetarian or doing meat-free Mondays or vegan days a few times a week, all of those things will make a difference. But I think one thing that is overriding all of that is who we elect into government. And I don't want to go down into politics, but it really does matter, because whilst our individual actions matter, the people who run the country have much, much, much bigger impact than we can have as individuals. So make sure to vote for starters, use your vote, that's really important, but make sure to vote in a government that is going to prioritize those sorts of things, because otherwise you can do as much as you like as an individual, but if governments aren't held to account, then it's not going to have as big an impact.
So that segues really quite nicely into the next question I had, which is something I wrestle with, one, from a just general point of view, two, from a mental health space point of view that I'm active in, and I'd say I can probably empathise with how you may feel within the sustainability space, is when you see these news reports, when you see these actions being taken, when you see X box being ticked, when you see the government doing Y, this person doing Z, I sometimes fall into a bit of an existential loss of faith, shall we say, and it makes me question whether there's anything as individuals that we can do to impact this change, and if things aren't changed institutionally, then can anything really tangibly happen, or are we just wasting our time? And then obviously that feeling will pass to some degree, but I'm just wondering and very interested to know, how do you manage your own mental health within the chaos, especially as the sustainability space, and still in some parts of the world, isn't even being taken seriously?
Yeah, of course. Well, it can be really frustrating, and I find that the more I learn, the more I read the news and engage with it, the more frustrated I can get. But frustration doesn't need to change. And I find that action is really the best antidote to that frustration and to anxiety about the whole thing. It's actually one of the reasons why I joined Leo's Box. I never actually set out to have a business. It wasn't really anything that was on my radar to do with my life, but actually I felt like it was something that I could tangibly do that would make a difference within my community. So it might not be a big business, but my individual action of joining the business, promoting it to my people, has meant that several other people, hundreds of people, have now made individual changes themselves. And so I think starting with what you can do can really ricochet out to the people around you. And that's how we make big change. It's not just about individual action. It's about how your individual actions affect other people. And I think that's a really good way both of making a bigger difference, but also about not feeling so disheartened about the whole thing. And just as one tiny example, I have not eaten meat since I was about 4 years old. I went vegetarian, pescatarian back then. And I got 3 sisters. All of my siblings used to laugh at me and tease me and make fun of me because it was something that was quite different back then. It really wasn't the done thing. And nowadays they're all vegetarian or vegan and they all understand. And I like to think that having access to someone who is doing that at a really young age made it more accessible for them. So yes, your individual actions do matter, but not just to yourself, but also to people who are around you.
It's reassuring to me to hear you have the exact same sort of coping mechanism as I do when I see something that, for want of a better phrase, pisses me off in the world of mental health, box ticking, corporate toxic culture, etc., because it makes me wonder actually how much more as an individual can be done to really have an impact that trickles down from the top. And then I'm reminded of very quickly that the conversations had on a daily basis, recurring consistently, if I continue to have them, that might trigger somebody else to continue to have them. And then all of a sudden you can map out a network of people are better off for one conversation being had if we looked at it at a really distilled down level. And I think that applies to everything. So whether you're, even in a workplace, to put it into a real world example, if you're in a workplace of 1,000 people and you're the only one that's talking openly about something or trying to impact change within a company, yes, it might be difficult to change things at an institutional structural level, but for an employee, person to person, manager to line manager to the sort of person below them, you might be able to start conversations that otherwise wouldn't have happened. And that's a very powerful thing, an opportunity that I think we all shouldn't pass up on. So, yes, we have the same coping mechanism for the mini existential crises that come from these things.
100%. Just also, I think one thing to do is to look at the sea change in the way that we talk about things nowadays. For me to have been asked on a podcast to talk about sustainability when most people view me as a fitness influencer is something that never would have happened a few years ago. In fact, there probably wouldn't have even been podcasts about sustainability. So we're talking about these things. The fact that every car advert on TV is about an EV car rather than a fossil fuel-based car, and that there are loads of plant-based options out there. Things are changing, things are moving, and it might not be fast enough, and it might not be as much as we would like, but it is happening. And I think by focusing on the fact that that is happening, you can start to feel a little bit more positive about the differences that are happening in the world at the moment, and that we are moving in the right direction.
Definitely. I think that's where it almost goes full circle with what we've spoken about today, whereby you're constantly reinforcing and giving yourself, I use the phrase, anchors through your fitness, your multifaceted existence as a businesswoman, as an athlete, as a blogger, and everything in between. It gives you a varied perspective on how to deal with things when you get that existential punch in the face, which is not a phrase I've ever used before, actually, but it's one I feel I may use again. Yeah.
Great.
Yeah. So I just on that, whilst we're on the topic, because it's something I wrestle with, and we were speaking about beforehand, is the difficult nature of being multifaceted makes it very difficult as an individual to look after your own health. So how do you monitor your day-to-day health, day-to-day existence to keep yourself in check, given you've got so many things to manage on a day-to-day basis? It makes it difficult to focus. I've just spoken with Johan Hari on the podcast, and he explained to me how our brains work in a more detailed way and how the systems of focus in the human body work. And we can only focus on one thing at a time. That's how brains work. And I try to time block to be able to do certain things, but like we were saying beforehand, you get pulled into this, you get pulled into that. So how do you manage it on a day-to-day basis with the variety of things that you do?
It's actually something I've been struggling with recently, and I definitely don't want to come across like I've got all the answers to it, because I chose to have a career that means that I do loads of different things, but that doesn't mean I necessarily know how to do it the best way possible. But for me, I find putting my phone away and turning off all notifications is really the best way for me to be able to focus. And I have what various people would call like a power hour. If I have a lot of work to do, I'll put everything away and I'll sit down, I'll stick my headphones in. I always put on the same music because it switches my brain into the mode of work or usually writing. And I will sit down for an hour and I'll just focus for that 1 hour. Our brains, as far as I understand it, can't really focus for much longer than that. I think it's like 52 minutes or something that we can focus for. And so I try not to do any more than literally sitting down and working for an hour at a time. That means probably going and making a coffee, popping outside, getting some sunshine, making sure that I get in my exercise, and then going back and sitting down and doing that work again, or some more of the work. But yeah, actually really setting aside, like you say, time blocking particular times to be able to do the work makes me focus a lot better. But this year, this January, I've been doing an awful job, and I really feel like I'm being pulled in so many different directions whereby I'm only really doing any one thing for like 3 minutes at a time. And we can't multitask. Our brains are not set out to be able to multitask. And so when you try and do lots of different things at once, you might feel like you're juggling, but actually in reality, you're just like being crap at all of them at the same time. So I'm trying to get better at that. And it's something I am actively working on, but I haven't quite got it right this year at least.
I feel attacked. But no, I completely agree, and it's funny as well because I'm so aware of my own flaws and my own challenges in this space, but still find myself time blocking and then thinking, oh, I'll just do this. Yeah. Oh, I've got to go and train now, but it's quite late and it's dark. Oh. Yeah. And then I sit there for 25 minutes being like, oh, I don't want to, but knowing that I will because it's just what I do and I've been disciplined enough to do it for years. So then I'm annoyed afterwards because I wasted 25 minutes thinking about not doing it. I'm like, Fergus, what are you doing? So it's I don't have the answers either, put it that way.
Can I say, though, I think that is extremely relatable for a lot of people. I do exactly the same. I'll get changed into my workout gear, and then I'll sit on the bed for ages, just being like, yeah, I should go out, I should go for a run. Yeah, I should definitely still go for a run. And 20 minutes later, I've still not gone for a run. And then I'll go for my run, and then I'll come back and be like, when I get back, I'm going to shower, I'm going to go and get this work done, and I'm going to go to the post office, I'm going to do this. And then I'll be 20 minutes later, still on the bed, being like, should really get in the shower. And it happens every single time, and I'm just not very good at it. But you know what, we're all the same. And actually there's a saying, like, if you want something done, give it to a busy person, because actually there is something to be said for the fact that when you're busy, you are forced to do things at the time that you say that you're going to do them, and it means that you get so much more done. And I don't just mean like packing your day full of loads of stuff. I mean like planning and making sure that you get everything done at the time that you say that you're going to do it, because otherwise there's no physical way that you're going to be able to do everything.
100%. And it's funny because, excuse me, I guarantee there's never a run, well, maybe I'm wrong, but have you ever had a run where you come back into the house and thought, that was stupid, I probably shouldn't have done that?
Not except for one where I injured myself, and I knew that I was
going to caveat that. I thought the second I finished that sentence, oh no, broken leg, one run. That's a definite answer there, Fergus. Stupid question, but no. To move on from my poor phrasing there. The final thing that I'm curious to hear from you, you've touched on two real macro level changes that people can make from a day-to-day basis, specifically on sustainability and just ethical training in general terms, or ethical living, shall we say. What are the 3 habits, if you believe there are 3, that individuals listening can begin to implement from tomorrow that can help them lead a happier and more fulfilled life?
Great question. First one, I have to say, is prioritize getting out in nature. At the very least, out into your local park, but the wilder the better. And practice being present in the moment. The great thing about walking, or even running, but especially walking, you can't really be on your phone at the same time because you're going to trip up and fall snap in your face. So put your phone away, even leave it at home, and just practice being present in the moment. And again, it's something that sounds really wanky, but that is the way. There's like loads of studies that show that being present in the moment is one of the ways to be the happiest. So that's one. I prioritize it, and it is literally the thing that makes the biggest difference for me. The second one is a kind of productivity tip, but it's also a happiness tip, because I find that when I have been productive, I get more rest time. and rest is really important. So my second one would be, if something's going to take 2 minutes or less, do it now. And this is one of those things where people put things off for years or months or weeks or just like a really long time that it doesn't need to be put off for that long. And then it ends up taking them 2 minutes. And then once it's done, it's done. And I find those things just hang over you if you don't do them. And the stress, the cumulative stress of having these things hanging over you it can really, really wear you down. So if it's going to take 2 minutes or less, just do it now. You'll be so thankful for it, like half an hour down the road, and you're like, thank goodness I've done that thing. It's not hanging over me anymore. It just makes such a difference. It's just a weight lifted off the shoulders. And my next one is, what could be my next one? My next one is probably to go easy on yourself. That doesn't mean not pushing yourself when it comes to sports and fitness, but just be kind. I think especially this time of year, we set goals for ourselves that maybe aren't so achievable, or maybe they are achievable, but in the span of a year or a couple of years, and we set out to achieve them in January, and then we burn out within 2 weeks because it's completely unachievable within January, and then we never try it again. I think actually if you forgive yourself for times where you don't necessarily live within the way that you want to live, then it can make it a lot more appealing to then try again. And the cumulative effect of all those actions will lead you to get to the space that you want to be. So I think that feeling shame about not being able to do everything that we want to do is really the enemy of actually being able to get to the space where we want to be. So yeah, just be kind to yourself.
Fantastic. 3 real easy things to take away and start to implement as of tomorrow. So if you're listening, there you are. You know what to do. So thank you very, very much, Flora. Really enjoyed that, and best of luck for the rest of 2022.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me on.